for the United Nations, we also blew up an SS-20. And the Russian test range is in Kapustin Yar, which is now Kazakhstan. And so we went there, a huge media event. And we were allowed, I was at the Jeep with a American sergeant, go up almost to the missile before they before they blew up the dynamite. And then they said, well, you've got like 1 minute. We ran to the Jeep, he floored it, and went back to a safe place to observe. But the explosion, and we made it, and the sergeant told me, well, in a NATO force, Britain or the US or West Germany, they would never let personnel get that close to an explosion of that magnitude. And then there was a huge mushroom cloud like a nuclear explosion. And it was just dynamite, and then about a 70-mile-an-hour wind that went off for 5 or 6 miles. So
welcome to a special conversation for Times Radio. In 1987, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed by the Soviet Union and the US. The landmark agreement reached by Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan signaled a major de-escalation in the Cold War. It was the first treaty to completely abolish an entire category of nuclear weapons from both countries. We're going to find out more with Dr. Donald N. Jensen, Senior Advisor for Russia and Europe at the US Institute of Peace, who was involved in the treaty at the time. Donald, hello.
Well, thank you for having me on. Hi, and Merry Christmas.
It's great to speak to you, Donald. I've probably brushed over it there. This treaty was hugely significant. Just put it into its context for us. Why was it so significant?
Well, in a lot of ways, actually. After the Russians developed their nuclear force in the 50s, both sides had to grapple with how to deal with this incredibly destructive, horrific threat. So what happened over a period of 20 years, I won't keep you longer than a few seconds on this, is that the Soviet Union and the West, including Britain and the US, developed an architecture to control the development, the pace, the number of nuclear weapons. Strategic, hitting each other, but also intermediate range, which were weapons that the Russians could hit Western Europe, France, and Britain. And we had to counter, or decided to counter under President Reagan, by deploying weapons of our own to counter that Russian threat to Central Europe. There was at the time a large number of demonstrations by the West Germans in particular, but other on the street, I won't say pro-Russian, but groups concerned about nuclear weaponry, about the inadvisability of the West to do this to counter the Russian threat. Mm-hmm. So by the Gorbachev period, 3 arenas, as they say, of negotiations had taken form. Strategic, which is still an issue today. Intermediate, which were the weapons that would be involved in a European war. And then the so-called Star Wars, which is strategic defense. Once the sides in Reykjavik and after decided that we could trust but verify, INF became the most promising weapons systems which we could try to regulate, and so we did. But a couple things I would conclude with. Number one is that there was a lot of contentiousness about anti-missile systems. We didn't really have a good beat about Gorbachev for the first 2 or 3 years of his tenure, which began in 1985. So the issue of the West distrusting and the Soviets distrusting us was a very key element of these negotiations. So you asked what was unique about the treaty. First of all, they were destructive. The weapons were destroyed. And that was new. Before then, you couldn't do that with any certainty. And number 2 was the issue of on-site inspections. Reagan famously said, as I just mentioned, trust but verify, and certainly Mrs. Thatcher agreed. But in order to trust, to verify, you need data. And one of the sets of data you would get is you could monitor each other's missile tests. The Russians would test a certain system by firing it into the Indian Ocean from Central Asia, for example. And I assume they could do that for us. But you could also hide stuff. And that means that the issue of on-site inspections, these are called confidence-building measures, becomes important. If you can't trust the Russians, the Soviets then, not to hide stuff, then you have to go on site. And that's what I did. We visited 18 bases over 3 months. And we said, well, the treaty says you have, 4 SS-20s here. Show us. And they did that to us. And then we also monitored the production of weapons in Utah and in a place, Tchaikovsky's birthplace, in the Urals, where the Russians made some of these weapon systems. So it was step by step, extremely tedious, because you're trying to get a successful negotiations that doesn't give up your own interests, but also even basic things like, how do you say something in Russian that we say? Testing, research, these are understood differently. Deployment, these are understood differently over there than they were for us. And so even those conceptual issues take a long time to settle. We spent, even after the treaty, we were in a missile base about 1,000 miles from Moscow. And we got huge mountains of caviar, but 12-hour bus rides to get to the bases. And we spent about 8 hours discussing what's the difference between remark and comment in Russian. One implies negative and criticism, and one does not. And we had good Russian speakers. We didn't really know what the difference was, but one of the Strategic Rocket Forces officers' wives said, Gorbachev and the Kremlin want this to work. And so we settled the differences. And this gets back to where we are today with Putin, where there's, frankly, I think, less trust of one side to the other than there was under Gorbachev. And all this stuff, the INF Treaty is no longer in effect. All of this stuff, on-site inspections are pretty much gone. We have our reunions, as we talked about. And so all of this architecture has to be rebuilt now again. And this is really, really challenging, because you've got new weapon systems like cyber, like space weapons, and even more destructive missiles. And second, because you've got the rise of China. And China has strategic forces, and they're building up, by the way, which are operating under a doctrine that is markedly different than the Russians and the U.S. So as the U.S. or the British or whoever debate what to do and how many and where their nuclear forces should be, you've now got to take China into account. You never had to do that before. So in a way, it's being rethought based on what we did to some extent, but in a new situation with less trust. And that's pretty much where we are now. And the danger is that you'll have a new nuclear arms race or other kinds of destructive races, and nothing will happen. So in a way, in that sense, we're back to the 1950s, where there were no arms control treaties. I should say that the word now is no longer arms control. They say strategic stability.
Yeah, that's interesting. The language stuff is really fascinating, actually. And also, at least, was that a lot of this was about opportunism, actually, that both sides saw a chance for progress. And so, to put it bluntly, they went for it.
Yeah, and they did. And no doubt, Gorbachev had his own hardliners to deal with at home. So I think both sides realized there was a political problem at home as well. We had in the early 80s, and I was a child arms controller at the time, kind of I won't call it a hardline, a segment of American expert opinion which thought the Russians were cheating, which thought that they could go for a first strike, they could break out of the limited arms control architecture that we had at the time. And so Reagan and Thatcher, I assume, in your country, had to deal with these perceptions, because it's always easier to hype the threat than it is to deal in a more peacemaking direction. And in fact, I'm pretty hard line about the Russians, but you have to really deal with reality and somehow put your perceptions or misperceptions aside. I can remember we inspected one base, and we, the weeds were 6 feet high, and I learned all my Russian words for berries because we had to eat them. But we inspected a base, and we looked at a berm, kind of a little hill with a door underneath. Mm-hmm. And one of my friends, a sergeant in the U.S. Army, said photo interpreters have been arguing about whether the Russians are storing illegal weapons for years. and we had a right to challenge anything. Show us that. Show us that. Show us that. So we said, open that door, and there were just lizards in there, and that's how I learned. That's how I learned the Russian word for lizards. But we called back to Washington, and in those days, mobile phones were about as a yard wide, and they wouldn't believe it. We said there's no evidence of cheating here,
Wow.
and they said we don't believe you. Check it again. So in a huge perimeter, we had to do the whole thing again, which was 10 square miles, and walk over everything. So I'm not trying to play moral equivalence here, because certainly it was in many ways an evil empire and all that, but you feed on your own suspicions and uncertainty in a way, and it's easier to be hard line, and I'm often hard line, but to break beyond those barriers takes some real leadership. And that's, I think, what certainly Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and by the way, the Pope, John Paul, did, and in different ways, but working together, did it very well. So it was a exciting time, and those things are scary when you're in the middle of the woods. Now, independent Ukraine, and you see a truck going by with a missile that could wipe out Britain, and it's very, very scary. And then there were always, however, if I'm not going into too much detail, indications of the difference in culture. When we blew up an SS-20, for example, we can get into that, but when we would challenge a SRF, Strategic Rocket Forces officer, about something on the rocket, often it was a lieutenant or a captain who would get up there and do the bolt himself. And in the U.S. Army and NATO, and certainly the British Army, the famous British sergeants would do it. So American military, Western European military, is much more decentralized than the Soviets were. And that we've seen that same phenomenon in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians have a much more Western-style command structure than the Russians do, where it's very top-down, and the generals pretty much control and order everything.
Yeah. I'm quite struck by what you said there, Donald, about sort of being on the ground and how nervous it was to kind of be in these sorts of situations. Can you tell us more about that? How big was your team? How many friends and colleagues did you have, and how did you?
Well, there were sure, glad to. The team was brought in. There were maybe 10 teams of 10 people with a almost native-speaking Russian speaker. In my case, a Marine colonel, who was still one of my best friends. And we did the very first flight. So when there's such a legacy of hostility between the two sides, and you know that hardliners around Gorbachev are not happy with the treaty, when you're going over Soviet airspace for the first time and looking at their nuclear weapons for the first time, you really don't know what would happen. And as I mentioned, many of the U.S. team chiefs had been in West and East Berlin when Major Nicholson, their colleague, was shot doing activity that was allowed under the agreement. So we didn't know what would happen, and it turned out that, as I mentioned, the officer's wife said Gorbachev wanted this to work, and that made it much more interesting. And if he didn't want it to work, they could spin yarns for months and months and months. And I had seen that myself when we backed up the Geneva talks. We would argue about every comma, and so forth. So we just didn't know what would happen. There is a great movie, if I can, Sean Connery and Michelle Pfeiffer, called Russia House, which was done in 1990. Extremely good at the music, the visuals of Gorbachev's Russia as it was going off the rails, and it's a story about their relationship. But it's extremely good at portraying that sense of uncertainty about where Russia would go just before the coup, when people were unhappy, many of them, with the arms control deals with the United States. So for atmosphere, it's really, really terrific movie, but it conveys that very well.
Yeah, and I mean, did you get a warm welcome when you went on that first trip? What was that like?
We did. We would go to the. We would tell the Russians on a Friday night, the Soviets. I keep saying that. Yeah. There's a carryover. We would tell the Russians on Friday night, I think, or Saturday morning. No, I guess we would fly to Moscow from Frankfurt on Saturday morning. We would then tell them where we wanted to go, and they had, I think, 3 hours to fly us there, and it could be way in the boondocks, and then or fly us to a city like in Belarus. Then they would put us on the bus. We'd go another 6 hours and tell me, you saw the country. You saw the country. I saw one small weapon system, an SS-4, which was a shorter range rocket that could take out a city.
Mm.
And I saw that on this concrete platform on the ground, they had painted an arrow and it said, I think, London, to show it was it was that way. So again, you saw how, and again, typically Russian way, where they're not as high tech as we are. You saw how they compensate for their technological backwardness, I guess you'd call it, by toughness and other ways. So it was a very interesting thing. But you also saw, this was '88, so you saw the beginnings of the dissolution of the East Warsaw Pact and the East European Bloc. So we inspected the bases in Czechoslovakia, which were in the hills behind Prague, through the very beautiful area. And when we declared we were going to Prague, which is now elegant and dominated by British soccer hooligans, it was dark and Soviet. But the Czech generals, who were nominally the allies of the Soviets, told us when we did the press conference afterward that they didn't even know we were coming because the Russian Soviets did not bother to tell them that we were going, to show who was in charge, I know. And also, they were passing us good Czech beer under the table, violating the rules of their Soviet betters in the middle of the press conference. So it was a lot of fun. I've got a room full of various souvenirs, books of Lenin, Strategic Rocket Forces uniforms, everything that's been in storage for 20 years. But I could put them up on eBay and maybe get $5 for all of that.
I'm sure you'd get a lot more. You'd get a lot. I mean, it's interesting you say that it was fun, Donald. There was fun to be had. Was there laughter on these trips where you were on buses for hours to look at,
Oh, there was.
weapons that could end humanity? But I suppose people there is a bit of a community feeling about that in some ways.
There is. I've done a lot of negotiations with the Russians, and I always feel that once you crack the external crust of their given orders, and I find this even when I debate on TV now, Russian experts. Once you crack the trust, then they loosen up a little bit and they joke and all of that. And their sense of humor sometimes is very much like ours. Not like the British sense of humor, but it's more like the American stuff. Yeah. So that works. And those cultures, if you probably know, are much more geared to personal interaction with people. We are Anglo-Saxons are more rule-based and all that. And the Russians know that, are that way, and the Russians then warm up a lot, I think, once you connect them on a human level. But they do say some crazy things, as you saw from Putin's speech in Moscow today. But they do, So so you have to be nuanced and appreciate the cultural differences, which are considerable. And also, if you speak Russian well, they really appreciate that. It's a very, very difficult language. And one of the generals told me that my team chief, the Korean colonel I mentioned, could be a new Russian television presenter. He was so good. But he would, Friday night in Moscow or wherever we were, he would be up there at midnight going over his vocabulary so he could say the right thing. And it's a very technical vocabulary. I can tell you now, even now, it's so long later, the names of missile parts, but I cannot tell you the flowers in the Russian garden. I don't know flowers. I do lizards and missile parts.
I want to find out more, Donald, about the explosion, the blowing up. I think it was an SS-20 missile, wasn't it? On one of your
and that is a very big rocket. And as I said, I'm not joking when you take out a Western European country. But the treaty provided not only for the baseline inspections, which were done to make sure what the Russians said they had, say 20 SS-20s in this base were taken away. We had to verify that they were taken away. And that was really the purpose of the base inspections. But for the United Nations, we also blew up an SS-20. And the Russian test range is in Kapustin Yar, which is now Kazakhstan. And so we went there, a huge media event. And we were allowed, I was at the Jeep with a American sergeant, go up almost to the missile before they before they blew up the dynamite, and then they said, "Well, you've got like 1 minute." We ran to the Jeep, he floored it, and went back to a safe place to observe. But the explosion, and we made it. And the sergeant told me, "Well, in a NATO force, Britain or the U.S. or West Germany, they would never let personnel get that close to an explosion of that magnitude." And then there was a huge mushroom cloud, like a nuclear explosion, and it was just dynamite, and then about a 70-mile-an-hour wind that went off for 5 or 6 miles. So the lesson for me was also that even conventional weapons are extremely dangerous and powerful, and we should never forget that.
Did you say the wind went on for 5 or 6 miles from the explosion?
Yeah, 70 miles an hour.
How big was it? Can you put into context how big the rocket was?
An SS-20 rocket, I would say, is bigger than those nice monuments you have than you have the Lord Nelson. Let's say,
wow. So in Trafalgar
75 yards tall. I'm guessing. I haven't looked at Wiki lately.
Yeah.
And they packed it with dynamite, and then blew it up for the United Nations, and we just ran away quickly, hoping it wouldn't hit us. So again, imagine this hitting a nuclear weapon of that kind, of that size, hitting a city. The destruction is just really unbelievable.
Yeah. And so, Donald, what about, how did the explosion for that come about? So was that following an inspection, you spotted it and said, that's not allowed, we need to do something about this?
Yeah, well, what happens is the treaty and international agreements provided for everything, but inspections, monitoring of production, and also destruction of the missiles. So you take the nuclear warhead out, put it somewhere, and storage of nuclear weapons is even now an issue. You put that somewhere, and then the missile itself, the delivery system, is then blown up. And that's what we were doing.
Gosh.
And so I don't know, I forgot now, I guess it's been a while, if there are actually provisions for destroying that nuclear material. As I recall, and I don't want to make you get about the bad mail, they could recycle the nuclear stuff for other purposes.
And I mean, that is an interesting thing in all of this, I suppose, is that some stuff was allowed and some stuff was not allowed. And when you were kind of doing inspections, I suppose in theory, and tell me if I'm wrong, on the ground, you could walk past some weapons and say, yeah, you can keep that.
Exactly.
Yeah, you can keep that. Yeah.
Exactly. But mostly they were clean. They had taken everything out. And as you know, and in fact, even when you watch when Ukraine has hit Russian targets, or whoever hit it, but pro-Ukraine, no doubt, that stuff can be monitored pretty carefully closely by photo interpretation imagery. So you can see that in this base in the North Caucasus. And I'm reminded of a year ago from now what happened when there was an explosion at a Russian aircraft base. You can see that. You can see they have six planes on the tarmac. And to make sure that all is legitimate, they sometimes are required to do some things with the planes, take them apart, show a piece of equipment that can be verified for photo imagery. And when missiles are shot, remember there was a big debate, you don't remember it, in the 80s, about there was not a debate about only a debate about whether they wanted to have a first strike. There was a debate about, do they work at all? And there was a British writer, I think Andrew Coburn, who wrote about it, and no, they work, and you get telemetry. I can't talk much about it other than to say you get telemetry data. I assume they do about us about this stuff, and they're flying or testing or something. So even now that we talked about Putin making a symbol or statement about his willingness to use nukes, you can, if you do a test in the Arctic or have a nuclear test anywhere, or a nuclear test underground, we can see that, and they can see it, that we do that too. So they monitor where a British aircraft is, American aircraft, submarines. but there's not everything you can do. You can still hide things. You might be able to take that nuclear load off an SS-20, put it in a garage somewhere, keep the Americans away, and then go back up. So
Yeah.
all of that had to be verified. It's a verification, and that had to be verified, and it was over a period of years, which, as I said, was very, very contentious and worked. And now we have problems with the Chinese and Russians about verification, because weapons are now so powerful and so quick, you barely have time to react or see what's going on. We've seen Putin try some of this in Ukraine. The Chinese, as far as I know, are more murky about all of this. And so you get this debate again. And when you see Putin talk about the West and NATO, in many ways, the tones are very much like we did with the Soviets in the early 80s, with the situation even more complicated for the reasons I've said.
And do you then, Donald, when you recognize that tone based on your experience, is there any glimmer of the opportunism that we discussed at the start, that there might be a way in to make some progress today?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because for USIP here, I'm writing a paper on how to negotiate with the Russians.
Right.
And I would say that I'm sort of on. In fact, here is a book supposedly based on KGB lessons called the Kremlin School of Negotiations. And what you learn is that the Russians don't care about a rules-based international order. They care about strength, but they also take advantage of opportunities. So you've got to be firm and understand where they're coming from, even as you test what they stand for. And that's a very, very hard balance to get if you're a Westerner. The Brits are cynical, notoriously, but you got a lot of kind of idealists everywhere, including there, including here, who don't want to see it that way. The Russians see negotiations really as a variant of competition, which is related to using war to advance their interests. But if you have strength and if you take advantage of opportunities, it will work. It worked in the 80s. But unfortunately, I think for the moment, the atmosphere in the Moscow of 1987 and 8, with Reykjavik and a leader who wanted to make it work, is very different from Putin's Moscow. And I guess I recommend his, in a bad way, his comments at the Ministry of Defense Collegium this morning in Moscow. It's worth reading. It's very alarming. And what's one of the things most alarming is that he's sort of in a land of Russian unicorns and misinformation and distortion, which really has very little to do about what Ukraine is and what the NATO wants and what the U.S. and the West wants. And so those hardliners routinely put out nonsense. And somebody believes it, I think.
Can I ask you now to reflect, Donald, on the responsibility that you had during the inspections that you were carrying out? And I suppose, first of all, how aware you were of that responsibility at the time, how you reflect on it now, and where you would consider, particularly, I suppose, the US, but kind of, Western alliances, where are they placed when it comes to exerting the same level of influence that you guys carried those years ago? Because you were influential, you made this happen, and we've discussed some of the reasons why. But I wonder, when you reflect on the responsibility that you had and carried then, and you look now at the Western countries and think, hang on, what are they missing out on?
Missing out on then or now?
No. What are we lacking
yeah,
today?
yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. You sometimes wonder when you're in those 8-hour negotiations about the meaning of a word, if it's worthwhile. It's very hard to be analytical and non-ideological about where you're coming from. It's very, very hard, whether it's a European issue or an issue in the United States. It's very hard to step back and be dispassionate. And that's a problem even today. And I'm not allowed in my job to comment on anybody's internal politics, but it's very, very, and there are a lot of people who fall short of that. And so you've always got to take a breath, step back, and then look at what are the facts, what does that mean, and where do we go from here and construct a policy around it. I think a lot of people, going to today, I think a lot of people don't know Russia well enough, if you say that they don't want a negotiated settlement in the way that we do, that takes work to find that out, and it's much easier to fall into conventional wisdom about this or that, or about Putin or Ukraine, uh, and that's very hard, as I said, to step back from, to get beyond the kind of set ideological worldview and just deal with what's going on. And Ukraine, at the moment, and where a lot of people are kind of concerned and worried, Ukraine is a victim of a huge amount of misperception. It has been from the beginning of the war. It is a democracy. The people in Ukraine, especially your age, if I can say that, talk and think very much like you guys do. If you go 50 miles to the east, they don't. The Russians don't, at least in large part. But it also has its shortcomings, which are always talked about. The so-called corruption. Putin talks about nonsense like Nazism and all that. But to get just on what is Ukraine, as an example, it's extremely hard to get a focused point of view, because people tend to fall on one side or the other. And that's, again, your jobs as journalists, so I could speak for you, and my job as an observer, is it has to get what is going on. Call, as we say in baseball, call the balls and strikes, and then worry about that later. And, you've got myths. You've got people think that after Putin there will be a bounce back. Snapback is the word. Snapback to democratic Russia interested in integration with the West. There's no evidence for that at all. And there was no evidence for that in 1991, but there was some evidence that that might happen. And so it's in that way a very disappointing state of events. When I teach at Hopkins, I tell my students that, in my own view, just my own view, I think Americans are often too bad at foreign policy. And I say for several reasons. Number one is we think that history doesn't matter. Number two, we think that culture doesn't matter. Number three, Americans tend, not everybody, but we tend to think that for every problem, there's a solution. And then fourth, we think that if there's no solution, there must be no problem. And that last one in particular is really, I think, especially apropos when you're talking about Ukraine and where European security goes, because this is really ultimately a matter of the West as a community, I would say civilization. It is about European security, and that involves the UK, Estonia, Portugal. And when you're just talking about Ukraine and the counteroffensive, it's easy to lose sight of the bigger states. But I can assure you, spending a lot of time reading the Russian hardline, I almost said literature stuff, it's not how they see it.
Yeah. It's amazing, Donald. We need, at this moment, it feels like we need people like you who took part in something unprecedented to do that again and to make history again. Today, and ideally in 2023, but in 2024, if not now. Do you know what I mean? That we need almost a kind of unique a moment as we saw with you guys in 1991.
Well, thank you. If I could add one more thing, which is that the grinding down by government bureaucracies on all sides, by every country, really is an impediment to leadership of the kind that's shown by Thatcher and Reagan and the Pope. I mean, you've got to step outside the box and realize that the Russian missiles do work, and they all also have their problems. And it's not that intellectually clean to think about it as black and white. I mean, to think of it so complicated. They think about it in black and white. So you've got to step beyond that, and it's not always easy. I'm sure you and you two have your own bureaucratic challenges where you work. I'm just speculating. But
strangely accurate.
Yeah, but you write a paper for a State Department or someplace, and they muck with it for 2 weeks, and it's too late. You look at the Ukrainian need for assistance now, and I can't comment about politics, but all of this stuff in NATO and the EU is boxed up in bureaucratic procedures, which are not particularly helpful at a time when bureaucracies have to move fast, which they do now.
Of course. Donald, it's a great privilege to spend so long speaking with you.
Well, thank you for having me on.